I'd like to introduce Joe Herring. He works for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the district forester. He's in central Iowa, so he's near where I live in Ames. He's been with the, been with 3 or 4 years now, 5 years? Almost 7. Oh, wow, time flies. I remember Joe when he came to Iowa State. So he got his undergrad and master's degree from Iowa State University. Here you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. All right. I'm just going to kind of ask for sound check in the back. Everybody okay back there? Good? All right. Great. Well, thanks for coming to this program. Welcome to the Tri-State 2014. And it's an amazing crowd this year. I told Jesse specifically I didn't want to have to do my program in the auditorium. And then I got there last night. I'm doing 2 programs today, and they're both in the auditorium. So that just stands to reason, I guess. The title here is Nuts and Bolts of Tree Felling, Basic Felling Safety and Chainsaw Maintenance for Woodland Owners. The reason I asked Jesse if I could give this talk this year, I really wanted to give this talk for a couple of different reasons. Mostly because I'm guessing, like you, I really, really love working in the woods. I mean, just flat out on Saturdays, weekends. I like it's not really killing time. I like to do forest stand improvement thinning projects. I like cutting firewood. You know, the occasional tree that needs to be cut down that's hanging over a road or near the cabin. I just love that stuff. And I'm guessing if you're hearing this talk, you probably do too. And until about 4 years ago, I was kind of just flying by the seat of my pants when it came to running my chainsaw. You know, I just picked up things along the way. You know, the ways I had seen people cut, like my dad. And then I started taking some training sessions, some real formal trainings. And I started to learn all the reasons behind the things that I maybe inherently knew or didn't know. And I realized that, you know, the people I'd been watching, like my dad, they've been flying by the seat of their pants too. And so it's something that I really have enjoyed with these trainings, and it's something that I want to transfer to all of you, so that you know why you're doing the cuts you're doing, and that ultimately you're safe when you're out there working in the woods. So this is just kind of a quick outline of the program. I think I have 115 people signed up for this. So, you know, it's really tough when you do a program like this to satisfy everybody in the room and what they came to hear. On the far end of one spectrum, you know, it starts with the total beginner, and where does the gas go in the saw, where does the oil go in the saw, and how do you start it? And then clear over at the other end of the spectrum, you know, would be people who are real advanced and maybe doing their own custom logging. So I'm hoping that I'm shooting for the middle here. I'm gonna cover the topics that I think are important and that hopefully you do too. And we'll see where that gets us. So felling methodology, basic saw maintenance, and then, you know, if we get time at the end, I'd like to cover what I call the common pickle situations, those encounters that you have often in the woods where, you know, you might drop a tree and it gets hung up, and how you deal with that. Safety is something that is kind of inherent in the whole talk itself. And I know when I've gone to trainings, you know, it gets a little bit annoying when they spend a whole half day or a day on just basic safety stuff that you feel should just be assumed, like, you know, you need to wear a helmet or you need to wear chaps. So I put that under time permitting. You know, we probably won't even talk about safety stuff. Just kidding. Just kidding. But I promise I won't dwell on it for too long. You do have to have some safety stuff when you do a talk like this. So this is an interesting image. And by the way, the footnote down here at the bottom, if you ever find yourself giving a talk on chainsaw work and you go to Google to research or get photos, and you're looking at chainsaw and safety, there's a lot of gnarly pictures that come up on your screen. So that's interesting. But the data here is kind of old. It's from '94, but the newer data didn't have a chart with it, and the numbers were essentially the same. So what this just basically shows is that the vast majority of accidents that occur when operating chainsaws, where they happen on the body, that's almost always going to be on the legs or on the arms and hands. Not as much into the head or the upper body or even the feet. So that just kind of leads me to the next slide here, which is not even arguable, not debatable, the minimum gear that you need to have on if you're out there working in the woods and you want to be serious about it. Helmet, eye and ear protection, chaps, or some kind of resistant legging, boots and gloves. So also interesting when you use Google as a tool and chainsaws as a search word, you find all these guys out there who are cutting in Bermuda shorts and sandals, you know, and no kind of gear at all. It's interesting, I guess, to say the least. All right, basic safety stuff. The very first thing, this picture shows this encircling grip. That just means the thumb is wrapped clear around that handle. This is a really tough habit to break if you've already gotten into the bad habit, which I'm very guilty of. But you're running your saw and you want to have your thumb kind of out to the right. By wrapping that thumb clear around the top handle, it gives you total control, or at least a lot more control and power to hold that saw steady in the case of a rotational kickback. So that's real important. Just try to remind yourself of that. I always have to remind myself when I'm cutting. The chain brake is something that you need to get in the habit of using. It's interesting that there's some misconceptions out there, I think, about chain brakes, that you're not supposed to use them very often because it can either wear it out or it can wear out your clutch or something like that. Just not true. It's a safety feature. It needs to be invoked whenever you're pull starting that saw and whenever you're walking from one tree to the next, because inevitably what will happen is you'll get distracted, you'll look over here, and then you end up tripping. You don't want that chain to be moving if you trip and fall on it. And a lot of the older saws, of course, if you've been using them for a while, the carburetor might be a little bit out of adjustment. You've got to kind of feather the throttle to keep it from dying. And so use that chain brake. And then just some real basic stuff. You know, make sure you've got both your feet on the ground firmly, all your weight is equally distributed when you go to cut. Bend at your knees, not your back. That's just going to save on that lower back pressure. And so the next morning when you get up, you don't feel it quite as bad. And then keep that saw close to your body as you're walking and when you're cutting, so that you're not reaching clear out like this. Also going to save your lower back. All right, that's it for safety stuff. So I do really want to get right into the nuts and the bolts, that's the title of the program, of the felling and the cuts. This statement here, that every tree deserves a plan, I heard a logger say that at the first training I went to, and it was a real eye-opener for me. And it was something that has just stuck with me, and I remember it. Because, you know, you think of loggers as men, they're experts in their field. Especially this guy had been logging for like 25, 30 years. And now he teaches these programs. And I thought, you know, I used to think the loggers would just go through the woods and boom, 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 boom. They just drop trees left and right. They know exactly what they're doing. They don't even have to think about it. It's just reflective, right? Not true. This guy said, you know, this is serious stuff. This is dangerous stuff, and if you're going to be felling trees, it just stands to reason you take your time and you develop a plan for every tree. So we're going to go through, there's basically 5 steps. We're going to go through each one of these kind of quickly. First and foremost is basically every tree out there will have some kind of tendency, a direction that it wants to go already. It's very rare to find a tree that's so straight up, so vertical, with its weight so uniformly distributed, you know, that it's not tipping or leaning or wanting to go at least one way opposed to the other. So you need to look up. It's just a simple matter of considering these factors. Which way is it leaning? Where's the weight distribution on that tree? And also the wind, if the wind is real strong on that day. So that tree on the left, you can see if you draw a straight vertical line, you know, it's just got a slight amount of lean. The tree on the right here, I kind of drew an outline around the canopy of that tree so you can see where the weight is distributed. So it's just basic things, looking at that, which way is that tree wanting to fall if we're going to fell that. And then the second thing that you're asking yourself is, okay, well, where do I want the tree to go? Because it might not be the same. Where I want the tree to go is going to be dictated by 2 things. One, just wherever there's space, you've got to have room for that tree to fall. And secondly, we want to avoid doing some kind of collateral damage to our residual trees in that stand. This is mostly important if you're doing thinning operations, forest stand improvement, or custom logging. So at the intersection of those first two questions, which way does the tree want to go on its own, naturally, and where do I want the tree to go, we come to this fork in the road, basically. And the question is, well, can it actually be done? Is it physically possible? If it's not, that's the end of the game for that. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to override this fundamental rule of this law of physics, but you look up there in the sky and you look at, if all those trees are entangled up there and there's no room or no place for that tree to go down, it's not going to come down. It's going to get hung up. And then you got a real mess in your hands. And that's where you start wasting time, parking around with trying to get that tree back down. So it's got to have a place. Now, it might be that you see, well, if that tree over there was gone, I could get this tree down. And you go over to that tree, assuming it's one that you'd also be looking to cut down for thinning or for firewood. And you say, oh, well, this one would actually go down if I just get that one over there. And sometimes that's what it amounts to, is you might move around the woods and cut two trees just to get the original one that you wanted on the ground. But that's all right. As landowners, that's kind of the nice thing about, if you're not doing this professionally and it's just a hobby, you can afford to take that time. So assuming that those questions align and the answer is yes, we think we can get this tree down where we want it to go down and where it wants to go down. The next step is to look for hazards. Hazards, this is where you're looking up. Some of them are very obvious, widowmakers that are hanging up there in the tree, dead limbs that are still attached. They might have broken off in a storm and they're just hanging by a thread. You've got to be real cognizant of those so that when that tree falls, they don't break free. Some hazards are tougher to discern. So this is a real common image when you look up into the treetops. You really can't tell what's going on up there. There's a lot of branches intertwined and intermingling. This is a real important one to be aware of, because a lot of people have been injured or killed by branches that were hooked around each other or they were touching. And so when the feller dropped the first tree, it pulled the adjacent neighboring tree with it. And it doesn't pull the neighboring tree over onto the cutter so much as it breaks branches free from up in the canopy. And they didn't expect that. A guy who was a logger in my hometown, who's my age, he had a large branch come and bonk him right on the head. He didn't sustain a real serious injury, thankfully, but that branch didn't fall until about 30 to 60 seconds after the tree had hit the ground. So that was a case of one of those situations. All right, other hazards, you got to watch out for those vines, grapevines. They're pretty strong. If you've got those climbing up the tree that you're going to be cutting down, those need to be cut first or dealt with. Cracks in the tree are going to interrupt the control as you're trying to drop that tree, because you need that wood to all be sound as that tree's falling. And then rot and decay, which are going to usually be at the base of the tree. And if you remember the rapper Sir Mix-a-Lot, he sang about the big butts and how great they were. But in the woods and for loggers, when you see, what I'm trying to show in this picture here is the swollen base of that tree. And it's not the natural way that the roots flare out. It's an unnatural swelling. And you can see snow is sitting on top of it on this side and a little bit of snow on that side. That's almost always an indication of decay and rot in the base of that tree. It's almost always attributable to, well, some kind of physical injury that occurred to that tree in the past. So grazing can do that a lot of times, or burning can scar that tree, and it causes that rot and decay, and then that tree gets that swollen butt. All right, moving on through the plan. Fourthly is we need to have an escape route away from the tree. And this does not really mean like an emergency escape, just in case something was wrong, where do I escape? This means, how am I going to move away from that tree? How am I going to get away from the stump as the tree's going down? And that's really important. You don't want to just hang around next to the stump and watch that tree fall. You need to get away from it. Because things happen when a tree goes down. It can, when the top hits, it can bounce up and shoot backward. It can swing off to the side. You gotta be further away than standing right there when that stuff happens. So the escape route is not directly sideways away from the tree, and it's not directly behind the tree in the direction that you felled it. It's coming back at a 45-degree angle. It can be on either side of the tree. This needs to be at a 45. You need to try to get at least 10 feet away, I would say, in order sometimes trees fall fast and sometimes they take a little bit longer to go down, but just try to get away from that tree. And this means that if you have any obstacles or tripping hazards in that lane, you need to get those taken care of before you go forward. So here's an example. This tree, I wasn't going to cut this tree down. It was marked as a safe tree or crop tree and it's thinning. But I'm going to assume that I'm felling it directly at us, if you're the photographer, and you see all the branches and tops that are piled up against that tree because of them thinning elsewhere in that stand. It's going to take a long time to cut through all that crap, but I got to get it done. If I want to escape at that 45-degree angle, I'm just going to have to take the time and clear a safe route to get away from it. So there's no excuse not to. All right, last step in the plan. We're going to look up and we're going to identify what's called the good side of the tree and the bad side of the tree. This one's a little bit interesting. It's a little bit more abstract to understand. But basically, if you envision we've got this tree, we're going to try to aim it, straight ahead in this felling direction. When I stand underneath that tree and look up, almost always there's going to be one side, either to the left or the right, that's got more weight or more side lean than the other one. So the tree that you see right here in the middle, assume that the way it's leaning, the way it wants to go, and the way we're going to fell this is away from us. Well, when I stand here and look up, you see that great big branch coming off from the right side. That's an awful lot of weight on that right side. So what I need to do then is, that's what I'm going to call my bad side, and then over here on the left is what I'm going to call my good side. Because if something goes wrong as that tree goes down, this weight's going to pull on it over to the bad side. So I just don't want to be on that side of the tree when that tree goes down. I want to make my final cuts from the good side. And the logger who taught this in the class I was in, this wasn't really an official part of the plan, but he said this is something he's learned over the decades. And he said it's not going to so much save your life, or, a tree from falling on you, as much as it's going to save you a broken saw when the tree falls on your saw. Because you'll probably get away, but your saw won't. So he's saying it saves him a lot of crushed saws in the past. All right, so that's it. I'm going to review this real briefly. Every tree deserves a plan. Which way does the tree want to go? Where do you need it to go? Look up for hazards. Get your escape route identified and cleared. And then find that good side and bad side. All right, and that leads us into what I'm going to call the principles of these felling cuts and how to go about making them. So I know when back in the past, before I took any kind of formal training, the way that I thought trees fell down because of the way you can cut them, I'd see my dad go out and cut a tree, and he would cut a big hunk and wedge out of it, like this picture. And then he would come around from the backside and cut in from the backside, right? And then the tree would fall where the wedge was made. And I always thought, oh, okay, I get it. So you cut that wedge out, and then now there's no wood holding it up in that side of the tree. So then when he cuts it from behind, it has to fall where the wedge used to be. So how many other people believe that that's how that works? It's okay, yeah, admit it. That's how I thought it worked. It seems reasonable. But in actuality, it's really not how it works at all. It's something totally different. So the method I'm going to explain to you here now is what's called the open face notch or the hinge method. This is what's taught by FISTA, which is the Forest Industry Safety Training Alliance, and the Game of Logging program. I'll give you the links or the icons for these at the end of the show. So these are a couple of logging training organizations, training programs. And this is the one and only method that they promote. The reason that it's the only method they promote is it gives you total control of the tree when it's used properly, when you set up the cuts right. Now, it's not without its naysayers. So loggers are one of the biggest naysayers to using this method because what the open face entails is cutting this huge, gaping chunk out of the most valuable part of the tree, which is the butt log. So on a multi-$1,000 veneer walnut, they are absolutely not going to use this kind of felling method, at least most loggers. Are there any loggers here, by the way? Good. Didn't want to overstep my... but, even the trainers that I've been with have said, I understand what they said this to the other loggers in the room. They say, I understand you guys aren't going to use this method on walnuts, but at least you've learned it and you know it. So the other naysayers have to do with kind of the academics who say we shouldn't be teaching this method to landowners because there's part of the cut that involves bore cutting, which is where you plunge the tree straight ahead into the wood, and it's very dangerous for kickback situations. And it takes some upper body strength to do it too, and there's a technique involved in learning how to do it. So some people will say, well, let's just stay away from this method because we don't want people getting injured with kickback. And my response to that is, no, it's not an excuse to not teach people the safest way to fell a tree just because part of the cut, takes a little bit of time and practice to learn how to do. Ultimately, because of the way this method maintains total control and its directional felling power is so strong, in the end you come out ahead because you're safer, you can put wood on the ground faster in the end. There's less damage to the logs as they fall with this method because there's no barber chairing and side splitting and side scarring generally. I'll cover the barber chairing in here a little bit. So in the end, because you can put the trees right where you want to, you can skim out faster, you can just have higher wood productivity. All right, why does this method work? If you imagine having a twig and your intention is to break the twig in half, you try to pull the twig apart by pulling away straight away like Chinese finger cuts. Very, very difficult, if not impossible, to pull that wood apart. But if you bend it in half and you snap it like that, it's much easier. That's why this method works so well. So it's all about this hinge. If you just think about a door hinge and the way it folds, that's what we're doing with this cut, is we're creating a hinge of wood that's going to fold that tree down, and the tree just can't go any other way except to fold with that hinge. And by the way, there's kind of another term out there for hinge cutting. I want to make sure it's clear. That's not what this is. A lot of in southeast Iowa, we seem to have a lot of it going on. These guys are doing what's called hinge cutting for deer habitat improvement, where they're going out and they're just partially felling trees left and right through the woods. And you see here, this is what's called a barber chair. Barber chair is when you start to cut a tree from the back, and as that tree, the weight of that tree is pulling it over, it instantly splits longitudinally along its grain, and it does what you would imagine a barber chair to do when you set back into the sink. So it's very, very, very dangerous. And I guess all I'm trying to say is, whatever the merits of doing hinge cutting work for your deer habitat might be, it's certainly something not recommended because of that danger of doing the barber chair. All right, so let's get back to the hinge method, the proper hinge method. There's 3 basic cuts involved with this. The open face notch, which is what you see right there. The notch is just, this is what I called a wedge earlier. I used to always call it a wedge. And these terms, believe me, it's hard to keep them straight. I still intermix them sometimes. But if you think of it don't think of it as a wedge of wood, think of it more as a notch. A notch is something you cut a notch out of a piece of wood to make it bend, or a notch in a mountaintop, like a mountain pass. The notch is just a big chunk of wood you need to get out of the way. That's all it is. It's just a chunk of wood. You're cutting a notch to open space in that tree. So that's a big chunk right there in the front. Then the bore cut, the second part of it, the bore cut is just made in the center of that tree, and this is the part that's kind of controversial or dangerous, because you flip the saw on its side so it's horizontal, and then you plunge that bar straight ahead into the tree, and basically hollow out the center, all the wood from the center of that tree, from clear across the diameter, so that the only wood at that point is this part in the back, and then this part, this little gap right here. The final cut is this final back cut, and that's where you cut away the last part of the tree back here. So in the end, if you can tell from my diagram here, the only thing left, the only wood left holding that tree up is right in here, this thin, about an inch or 2 strip that goes all the way across. That's your hinge. That's that door hinge that folds that tree this way, over here. All right, just I made a little animation to kind of help illustrate this. So imagine that the cylinder there is a straight up tree trunk. It's got a little bit of lean. These barrels here, that's where your hinge is. So imagine here's your hinge. So when you set this cut up, the only wood in there that's holding it is where that hinge is. And the only place that tree can go is to fall where that hinge fell to. Now here's a cross section of a stump. The blue area there, just imagine that's all still attached wood. And we're going to come in and we're going to cut away. I'm going to show you this is the procedure or the steps involved. So first that saw comes in and it cuts out that notch. And that's what sets up the direction of fall. It might be kind of hard to see that, but that tree now has an arrow going this way. Over here, it's going to fall that direction. Then the saw is going to come in and do cut number 2, which is the bore cut. And it comes in here on the side. Careful not to cut the hinge away. And it bores in there like that, leaving just that thin strip of wood fiber, 1 to 2 inches wide. That's your hinge. Okay, then we're going to put the saw back in that hole where the bore cut was and just cut away all the inside until we get clear to the back. And then that leaves us with that holding wood. So at this point, there's only 2 pieces of wood holding that tree up. Our hinge right here, and this holding wood in the back. That tree's very stable still at this point. It's not going anywhere. And then the final thing is just to cut off that strip of holding wood in the back, and that's your hinge cut. So this guy's retreating, that tree's starting to fall now. He's retreating at a 45-degree angle from the good side of the tree. He's, if you have some other neighboring trees nearby that you can get behind, that's a good measure of safety to help protect you in case that stump kicks back and should somehow come at you. And then lastly, watch for falling limbs. Long after that tree goes down, be looking up, be watching. It's amazing how long after that those treetops continue to sway and dead branches can still come down. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of that hinge cut, the procedure. I'm going to show you some of the more detailed specifications when you're setting this cut up. First of all, when you cut that notch out, how deep into the tree do you need to go? This picture on the left here, the green line here shows what I would say is the center of the tree, right? That's right in the middle. The notch comes in here. In general, it should be about a third of the way into the tree. Now I say in general, and I'm indefinite about it, because in truth, when you look at the physics of this cut, the science behind it, it should actually be, if you came around to the front of the tree and then looked at your notch you just cut out, and you put a tape measure across the front of it right here, that should be 80% of the total diameter of the tree. So if you've got a 10-inch tree, that should be 8 inches across. So when I say a third of the way over here, that could vary depending on where you make your cut on the tree. If you make it up at chest height, actually if you make it at breast height, where the diameter is measured, and assuming the tree's perfectly round, then you'll always cut 4/5 of the way to the middle of the tree, because that's 80%. But if you make it down at the bottom where it might be flared out a little bit or just bigger diameter, you may not have to cut a full third of the way into the tree before you hit this 80% threshold. But that 80% threshold is just, that's how wide of your hinge, the part that folds the tree over, that's how wide that has to be for the cut to work properly. In terms of the angle of that notch, it's called open face notch because they want you to have a very, very wide open angle. Now, why is that? The reason is, if you think about that hinge and you think about a tree that's standing upright, your goal is to get that tree to fall clear over to the ground and land uniformly along the ground without any interruption. Because if it interrupts, if there's anything in between that tree's fall, it could bounce up and kick back. It could cause it to break or split. It does a number of things. So the reason they actually want 90 degrees of opening in that notch angle, which is really hard to do if you think about it, because the tree's already standing straight up at 90 degrees. So you can accomplish it in a couple of different ways. You can come down at 60 degrees and then come up at 30. You could come down at 45 and up at 45 and get 90 degrees. Here they show if you cut real low on a tree where the roots go sideways out, you could actually come down at a straight 90 and then over at 0 and get a 90-degree notch cut out. So this is interesting if you were one of the people who raised your hands when I said, you know, if you think about cutting out a big wedge and then the tree just falls where the wedge is gone. So, you know, it's the hinge. It's not the wedge that's missing. It's the hinge that you're setting up here. One time when I taught my little brother how to do this cut, he was just a few years younger than me, and so he went off and he was cutting some trees down, and my dad looked over and saw what he was doing, and he saw this big wide open face, and he went over and he goes, whoa, 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 stop, what are you doing? That's not a good wedge. That's too wide. And Brett said, well, this is how Joe told me to do it. He goes, oh, all right, well, one thing about your notch is that you cannot have any overlap or bypass when you make these cuts match up back in the corner there of the notch. Otherwise, your hinge does not function properly. So it's very easy to have that bypass, but thankfully it's also very easy to correct it, where you just come in and take a small sliver of wood off the bottom there so that those cuts match up very perfectly. So don't have any, they call it the Dutchman. Don't have any Dutchman. This just shows the cuts that are needed to correct these mistakes. All right, just a couple helpful tips. If you go out here and you're going to try practicing this, you have to aim that tree. You have to aim that notch, because your notch initially is what's going to set the direction of fall. It helps to kind of lean up against the side of the tree and then sight ahead where you're hoping to fall it. And I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of these chainsaws have what would be called like a gun sight machined into them. So see this black line on this steel chainsaw? That's an aiming sight. So you can lean up by this tree and look down at your saw and see that aiming mark, and that's how you tell your first cut where you want it to aim. So not all of them are black, painted black. My saw has a kind of a machined molded plastic line there, but it's not black. And then some saws just don't have that. But you may not know that. And then secondly, it's usually people want to come in on the bottom side of the cut first and then come down from the top. But it's a lot easier actually if you start with your first cut down from the top. That's mostly because when you come up from the bottom, it's hard to come up at a real steep angle. So it's easier to make that steep angle going down from the top. So that's a good picture of what the first cut could look like. All right, a few more specifications. On that hinge, remember 80% of the diameter is how long that hinge needs to be. And then in terms of the thickness, this is pretty important. 10% of the diameter is how thick of a strip of wood you want to leave for the hinge. If it's too thick, you've got too much wood holding it, and that tree stands for too long, or it doesn't fall right away. If it's too thin, if you left too thin of a strip, you just don't have enough wood flat out to hold it up when you need held. So it's very dangerous if you leave this too thin. Probably not as dangerous, but it's still a problem if you leave it too thick. All right, how do you set that hinge up? Well, here's my helpful tips for doing the bore cutting. This is probably the trickiest part. First of all, start with yourself on the good side of the tree. That can be difficult because some people just naturally cut better from the left side of the tree. I know I do than they do from the right, but it's something that gets better with practice. Equally as important is just don't accidentally cut off your hinge. Don't actually cut through your hinge. That's one of the worst things that can happen. Once you've done that, you've lost all control of where you want that tree to go. And what you're going to start by doing is initiate the cut with what we call the attack corner. So this may be new to some of you, it may be old to others. But on a chainsaw, you've got, because of the way it's designed, the way it works, you've got these different reactive forces depending on where you're at on the chain and bar. On the top, it's a pushing reaction. On the bottom, when you're cutting from above, it's a pulling reaction. And then out of the tip, if you divide it into 2 quarter sections, the bottom is what they call that attack corner, the top is that danger zone or that kickback corner. And that's where it's going to want to rotationally come back right at you. So when you make this bore cut, you want to start on this bottom corner of that bar. And if you remember where I had this animation, when the saw goes into the tree, initially it's on that bottom corner. That's the attack corner. Now, once the bar tip gets completely inside the tree, then you can start to rotate that saw around so that it's more straight on, and go ahead and plunge that tree right into it. Now, another thing to notice about that is that there's a slight angle going back to the left. Why did I do that? Because I don't want to accidentally cut off my hinge wood. So when you poke through to the other side, your saw tip should actually be a little further away over to the left. And what you do is usually just look around the tree and see where your tip poked out. And then you're going to bring the saw back around to the right just a little bit to straighten up, to even up that hinge. Then you can pull your saw out and you can actually walk around the tree and look at it and make sure it's that uniform thickness all the way across. One inch if it's a 10-inch diameter tree. If it's a 15-inch diameter tree, you're looking for 1.5 inch thickness. And that's plus or minus. I mean, this stuff doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to bring a little caliper out to wood. The bore cut has to be done at full speed, full RPMs. It's kind of like a football injury. If you go out there in the field and you're just running around half speed, you're probably going to get more likely to be hurt than if you go full speed. So the bore cut, if you try to do it just at half throttle, you're going to have problems. One thing about this picture, notice how he's going in very level with his notch. So they should be on a level plane. You don't want your hinge to be 3 inches high and then on one end of the tree and 1 inch high on the other side when you're done. So here it shows this guy, his saw poked out there about 1 inch higher than it should have. Anybody notice another thing about this picture and whether he's cutting from the good side of the tree or the bad side of the tree? It's all right. So that's really it for what I want to tell you about the principles of the cuts and my tips for helping you. Now it's really kind of up to you to go out and practice with this stuff. This is, in these training sessions, this is what we do. We have a practice stump, and all the students get to spend as much time as they need cutting out notches, making sure there's no bypass, doing the bore cuts, to make sure they can do that. When you get the hang of the bore cut, it's just like butter. It's nothing. I mean, once you've done that a few times, it's really quite easy. So, and it doesn't take that much time. Still, you have to kind of ask yourself, and I still do sometimes, is it necessary? Do you have to do the bore cut? Why bother? And truthfully, you don't always need to use the bore cut. I mean, if you're cutting trees smaller than 10-inch diameter, you probably don't even have enough material there to even make a big notch and do the bore cut too. But it's mostly an issue on larger trees, and especially trees that are leaning, that you have this very high risk of that barber chair action. So, you may go out and cut trees now, and 5 out of 10, 7 out of 10 trees you cut, you may not use this, but now you know why it's employed. So it's a safety issue. It's also a wood recovery issue, because if you're actually custom logging, or you want to drag a log out and have it cut up, and that tree splits in barber chairs, it's good to know how to do a bore cut so that you don't have that problem. The other thing is that by bore cutting, you get to predetermine the thickness of that hinge so that you make sure it's the right thickness. And that is what's going to give you that accuracy when it comes to directional felling. So it's faster production in the end, less damage to your residual trees, which is very, very important. All right. What about wedging? I mentioned using wedges, I think, in the program description for this. I wanted to tell you so much stuff about chainsaws, and I just don't have enough time to tell you everything. Everything I've told you up to this point, when you drive home today and you think about it, you might go, yeah, all he told us to do was how to drop a tree in the direction that he was already wanting to go. So how do we fell trees in the direction other than the one that they want to go? I'm gonna stand right here quick to click over. So just very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about felling trees against their natural lean. See that? We've got a bottle jack inserted under that tree. I thought this was a joke when I found this picture on the internet, but then the more I looked around, I realized I think they're actually using this as a technique over in Europe. But yeah, you can cut a big, hollow out a big area from the other side of the tree and put a jack in it and do it that way. That's one thought. But, you know, unless you're a logger and you own your own skidder, and by the way, when loggers get trees hung up, when they make mistakes, it's not that big of a deal for them because they have their skidder handy and they just wheel out that winch cable and hook on and just drag that thing right out. But I don't have that. I'm guessing that you don't have that either. So, you know, I rely on these little plastic wedges to try to do what I can. But, you know, there are limits to what you can do. And in general, this is, I mean, I use these kind of general. If it's tall and skinny and it's not leaning like this, I can usually use wedges to bring it back against its lean and drop it the opposite direction. Fat, short trees, those are tougher. Just because of the way the physics are. It's harder to get the leverage that you need. So there's actually very complex mathematical formulas that you're taught in these training programs. You have to figure out exactly how many feet of lean the tree has, and you do that by looking at its toes spread of canopy, and you draw a straight line down like a plumb bob, and here's how many feet. Then you have to go measure its diameter, and there's some calculations there with, you know, based on how tall it is and its diameter and how much it's leaning, it tells you how many inches of lift you need to bring that tree over. Again, there's not enough time to teach all this stuff in a program like this, and frankly, I don't go out in the woods with a calculator and, you know, I'm going, well, can I do that? I really just kind of play it by gut feel, and so if you're doing that like I am, here's kind of the quick and dirty of how that's done. So you set up the notch, the hinge, and the holding wood, just like you normally would, just like we already covered. Here's the notch cut out, the bore cut's made, you got a hinge right here, you got holding wood in the back. And then you're going to come in with wedges basically into that bore cut on both sides of the tree and pound them in until they're real tight. That's going to invoke some force on that tree. And remember, this tree is leaning to the right, they're assuming. It's wanting to fall this way, but they're wanting to drop it actually in the opposite direction. So you pound those wedges in tight, then you're going to just come around the back and cut off that holding wood. So at this point, the only thing left holding that tree up is your hinge, that thin strip of hinge, and then these wedges that you pounded in. And the tree's weight is all sitting on those wedges. And then it's a simple matter of pounding in those wedges, and that tree just gradually goes from leaning this way, up, to the upright, and then it falls over the opposite way. So here's just a picture that shows, that's my brother Matt. So this is a black oak. It's leaning downhill over here to the left. It's wanting to fall down here. But we just kind of, again, by looking at it, it was tall, it was skinny, it didn't have that much lean. We determined that we could set our notch on this side and bore cut and then pound our wedge. There's a wedge on the back side too. There's no holding wood holding it in the back. It's just, and that worked out pretty well in that case. So I'm sorry that I can't go into more detail on how to fell trees the opposite way, but that's just the nature of our limited time. So the final part of the program here is on the routine saw maintenance. And this is just as important, if not more important, than all the other stuff that we talked about. Why? Because, as I sit here, you need to be able to let the saw do the work. If you are running a dull chain, if you're running a weak saw, it takes all the fun out of the woods work. I mean, it really becomes a lot of labor, and I can't tell you how many times, you know, I've been out cutting with a buddy, and we're cutting firewood or whatever, and I grab his saw real quickly and go to cut something, and I go, geez, this thing is dull. I mean, it just doesn't cut at all. And he's having to force a lot of downward pressure. He's working twice as hard as I am because his chain's dull. It's not maintained. So, you know, I want you to continue to work in the woods and enjoy it as much as I do. So, first of all, if you have a notebook, you might want to write down, there's a great article in it's called the Nebraska Timber Talk newsletter. It's online. All you got to do is Google Nebraska Timber Talk. a guy named Dave Johnson. I think he actually wrote the article initially for Sawmill and Woodland magazine, but then they reprinted it in this newsletter. It's in the June 2009 edition of the Nebraska Timber Talk. And the article is called "The Chain's the Thing." And almost everything in my program I've just spun off of that article because it's so good. It's such good information and such good advice, I think. So what Johnson says, his two fundamental rules of maintaining your chain are right here. Always sharpen your own chain with a handheld file, and do it frequently or do it very often, but so that you're doing it in small doses. So this is a really tough one to get people to do. Because again, like 4 years ago or so, I was the same guy. I was, well, it's only $5 to take it to the saw shop and drop the chain off and have them use their grinder. Or my brother saying, well, geez, let's just buy a grinder. Why are we messing around with these files and these guides? The thing is that when you do your own chain by hand, you avoid this perennial problem of when you grind it, overheating the chain. And when you overheat the chain, it's because that grinder is just so hot, there's just so much friction. Boom, that chain loses its temper. And you see this in the blue. If you look at your chain, you'll see these little blue burn marks. So that chain's been burned. And when the temper is gone from the chain, it doesn't hold its sharpness at all or very long. And then the only way to go back and correct it is to keep using that grinder. Because once a chain's been burned like that, you can't even hardly file it anymore without the machine and grinder. So it saves you some money and time, and it just keeps your chain really, really sharp, really tip-top, keeps you happy, keeps you working in the woods. And once you learn, I mean, it's really basic stuff. Once you learn how to do that and get good at it, it takes almost no time at all. All right, but to be able to get to that point, you've got to understand how the chain works. And there's basically two parts to the chain that you need to understand. The first is the cutter, which is right here. And then the second is the depth gauge, or what's called the raker, right there. The cutter is what actually cuts the wood. Right? So in this diagram, I want you to look on this side. The chain here is upside down, but you can see this is cutting into a stump. The cutter is slicing through a very thin strip of wood fiber there. The depth gauge, or the raker right here, is the only thing it's doing is stopping the cutter from digging in deeper. Right? That's what prevents the cutter from going in too deep. And what do I mean by too deep? Well, so if you look here, here's the top of the depth gauge or the top of the raker, and then here's the top of the cutter. And it's this distance between those two, it's that dimension, that's how much wood is actually being cut when you run that saw. So you can imagine, if this was very, very thin, or if this distance, let's just imagine that the cutter and the depth gauge were the same height, the saw would not cut at all, because the wood wouldn't go into that, it wouldn't cut there. Now, if this distance was really large, in other words, if there's a huge gap between the cutter and the depth gauge, it would cut a huge amount of wood and it would rip the saw right out. It would rip your arms out of your socket, probably. So it's a very fine balance, that distance. And so all sharpening is just simply filing those cutters to keep that edge sharp. This is where most people get turned off on the subject because they see, well, how do I know what the right angle is? There's an angle here that needs to be proper. There's an angle there that needs to be right. There's a top plate angle. It gets kind of scientific. It gets kind of confusing. Very simple way to deal with that is just go to your saw shop and get the right filing kit for your specific chain and your specific saw. There's little numbers printed on your chain. That tells you what size, what dimensions, what pitch, and all of that. I won't go into it. Just go to your saw shop and ask them to get you the right filing kit. If they don't know which one it's going to be, you need to find a new saw shop. So you look at the chain. It's got these alternating teeth, like you see here. One cutter faces one side, and then the next tooth, the cutter faces the other way, and it alternates. And the first thing you look at, if you start to look around the chain, you'll find in one section right here, there's two cutters that both face the same way. And that's what I'm calling the starting length. Here you can see These two cutters are facing the same side, and my saw actually has this little lime green mark that tells me that's where that starting line is. The reason you do this because as you go around your chain and you're filing each individual cutter, this is what tells you when you get to the end, so that you don't keep going. So you find that starting lane. Oh, and the way to do this is to always start with the back one. Or if you're going to file the other direction, always start with the one immediately behind your two starting links. And that's how I do it, because every time I sharpen the cutter, then I slide the chain forward one link, and I sharpen the next one, and I slide the chain forward. So eventually when I come around, assuming I started with the one in the back, I get to the right point. So you just set that filing guide down on there. The first thing you'll see is, there's an axis, the vertical axis of your bar. And then on the file guide, there's a very thin grooved mark right here that you line up with the axis of your bar. That's what tells you what angle you need to hold that file at. Okay, then it's just a simple matter of pushing the file forward, a little bit of pressure in the upward direction that kind of keeps the file tight up underneath that cutter. And then you want that file to be perfectly flat as it runs along the chain. Not upward at an angle or not downward at an angle, just flat. You'll just do that first cutter, and then you'll advance the chain forward and do the next cutter, and just keep doing that for all the cutters that face that direction. Then you're just going to simply flip your file around and do the same thing for the cutters that are facing the opposite direction. First time you do this, it's going to take you forever, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and you're using your left hand. After you do it a few times, you get the hang of it. It goes pretty quick. Bottom line is when you're cutting, look at your chips. Okay, you should be seeing real nice big fat shavings or wood chips. Not if you're breathing in fine sawdust or if it's getting in your eyes when you're cutting, that's a dull chain. And then there's some markings on these cutters and on the depth gauge right here and here. You'll see there's a marking, there's a marking, there's a marking. Well, what are those for? Well, as time goes on and you keep filing away and sharpening this saw, you're filing away the metal, and that cutter recedes backwards towards that line. That line is just an indicator to tell you that it's time to get a new chain. There's not much metal left. The other thing that happens is as that cutter gets filed away and recedes backwards, this difference between the depth gauge and the cutter, what they call the depth gauge setting, that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So as time goes on, that distance is smaller. You have to correct or compensate for that by filing down these rakers or these depth gauges. And that's why that line exists on those depth gauges. So as you file that down, well, here's the tool that comes with your kit. You just lay that down over the chain. You see this is a raker sticking up through that hole. All you do is any part of that raker that sticks up through that guide gets filed back down so that it's below. Just like whack-a-mole. So as you do that, you increase that distance again, that depth gauge setting, and you bring it back into alignment so that it cuts the proper amount of wood. All right. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. When you go buy a new chainsaw, and they can tell right away when you walk in that you're a rookie, they give you the saw with what they call the low kickback chain. It's got a green or a blue label. Pretty much all saws have some version of safety chain on them. Those are tough because they make bore cutting a little more difficult. They also make filing the rakers down eventually more difficult. Whereas all the chains you've seen so far in my program have been what we call standard or chisel chain. So just something to be aware of when you go into the shop to get your next chain. You can stick with the safety chain, or you can ask them for the yellow label stuff, and that's gonna really help you out. All right, I'm going to kind of fly through the basic routine stuff. You need to keep, this is the area around the clutch. You pull off this cover right, and your bar goes right here, and you pull that off. You just need to clean off all the dirt and stuff, from this, all that gunk and grease and oil, so that it looks clean like this. And by the way, when you're looking at that, if you didn't know this, there's a little port right there, and that's where the oil comes out for your chain and your bar. So make sure that that's free and clear. That's very important. Pay attention to the way your bar looks over time. It can wear out. The rails on it can get uneven, or they can get metal burrs. They can warp if they get too something that you're going to probably have to take into the shop to get repaired. And then on your bar, this is that depth gauge tool, that filing tool for filing on your rakers. See on the tip here, it's got a little, it's made on purpose so that you can run that down the rails and clean out all the garbage that gets in those rails. And then there's a little hole right here, that's the oil port, where the oil comes out of the chainsaw and runs down the rails. Keep that clean. Every once in a while, just flip that bar over. I kind of do it every other gas tank fill up. Just flip that bar upside down, and that's okay. You're supposed to do that. That's what keeps that bar, so it's like rotating your tires. And then if you take your saw and kind of hold it down at the ground and aim it at the snow or aim it at a stump, and then just full on rev that saw, you should see buildup or accumulation of oil. And that tells you that bar is oiling properly on the bar and the chain. If you don't have oil sticking off of it, you probably need to take it in and have it looked at. Make sure it's oiling. Finally, last thing here, and this is probably the most important, especially if you're going to steel, which I do, is you need to keep the air cleaner freshened up and clean very, very often. So they recommend daily if you're cutting with it for a few hours at a time. And whatever method you use, some guys use warm soapy water and actually scrub it with an old toothbrush and then let it dry and put it back on. That's probably the best. Some guys blow it out with the compressed air. I was down at the cabin and all I had was this old scrubber brush, but it worked pretty well. It doesn't matter too much. It depends on the type of air cleaner that you have too. You just need to get it cleaned out. And then the perennial question that everybody always wants to know, which saw is best? Is steel best or is husky best? These other kinds, Johnson Red and Dolmar, they make really good saws too. I fall into the camp of they're all very, very good saws, and in the end, I think you should just look at the customer service that you're getting at the local saw shop and which guys can they're friendly to deal with. They'll take you on and work on it and go with whatever that is. So, well, you've been educated to the tune of 1 hour's training. Let's not do that. So I do recommend if you are going to be doing this a lot, if you're going to be cutting a lot, take a look at some of these training programs. They're very, very good. Some of them are very geared towards loggers, and so as a landowner, you might have to take that into account. But take a look at those, the Vista and the Hinge logging programs, and that's all I got.